Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're diving into some rather interesting school stories from Reddit. Some of these situations are so messed up, they'll make you question everything about how schools actually work if you haven't questioned it by now. Come on, it's nearly 2026. School is most definitely cooked at this rate. Anyway, let's get into these stories. Grab whatever you're working on, get comfortable, and let's dive into some stories that will probably make you grateful for your own school experience, even if it sucked. Let's start with this first story that honestly made my jaw drop when I read it. I was in 10th grade when this happened, and I'm still angry about it 3 years later. Our school had this policy where, if you were absent for more than 3 days in a semester, you had to bring a doctor's note, or they'd mark you as truant. Fair enough, right? Well, I ended up getting mono during February of my sophomore year. If you don't know what mono is, it's basically this virus that makes you exhausted all the time, and you can barely function. I was sleeping like 16 hours a day, and could barely stay awake long enough to eat. My mum took me to the doctor on day 2 of being sick, and the doctor confirmed it was mono. He said I needed to rest for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3, and wrote me a note excusing me from school for up to 4 weeks, depending on how I recovered. The note was on official letterhead, had his signature, and everything looked completely legitimate. I ended up being out of school for exactly 17 days. During that time, my mom would email my teachers every few days with updates about my condition and asking for homework assignments I could do from home when I felt up to it. Some teachers were really understanding and would send work that I could do at my own pace. Others basically ignored the emails completely. When I finally felt well enough to return to school, I brought the doctor's note to the attendance office first thing in the morning. The secretary looked at it, made a copy, and said everything should be fine. I went to my classes feeling relieved that I could finally get back to normal life, even though I was still pretty tired and weak. 2 days later, I got called to the principal's office during 3rd period. Principal Harris was sitting there with a file folder open in front of him, and he had this expression like I'd committed some serious crime. He told me that, despite my doctor's note, the school was concerned about my extended absence and the amount of school I'd missed. I explained that I'd had mono and been following doctor's orders, but he said that didn't change the fact that I'd missed 17 consecutive days of instruction. Then he dropped the bomb. He said that because I'd missed so much school, I was going to be required to repeat 10th grade. Not just make up the work I'd missed, but literally do the entire year over again. I was completely shocked and asked him how that made any sense when I had a legitimate medical excuse. He said that state education policy required students to be present for a certain percentage of school days, and my absence had put me below that threshold. I tried to explain that I'd been doing homework from home when I could, and that most of my teachers had been working with me to stay caught up. Principal Harris said that homework wasn't the same as classroom instruction, and that the school couldn't make exceptions to attendance policies, even for medical reasons. He actually said that if they made an exception for me, they'd have to make exceptions for everyone. My mum came in for a meeting the next day, and she was furious. She brought documentation from the doctor, emails showing that she'd been in constant communication with the school, and evidence that I'd been keeping up with assignments when possible. Principal Harris wouldn't budge. He kept citing this state policy about required attendance percentages and saying his hands were tied. My mum asked to see the exact policy he was referencing, and he pulled out this massive binder of education regulations. The policy did exist, but when my mum actually read through it carefully, she found that it included exceptions for extended medical absences with proper documentation. Principal Harris tried to claim that the exceptions only applied to certain types of medical conditions, but the policy didn't say that anywhere. The argument went on for over an hour, with my mum pointing out that the doctor's note should qualify me for the medical exception, and Principal Harris insisting that 17 days was just too much time to make up. Finally, my mum said she was going to contact the district superintendent and possibly a lawyer if the school tried to hold me back for having a documented illness. That threat seemed to change Principal Harris's tune pretty quickly. He said he'd need to review my case with the school board and get back to us. A week later, we got a letter saying that after careful consideration, they'd decided to allow me to continue with my grade level as long as I made up all the work I'd missed within 6 weeks. The problem was that making up 17 days of work, while also keeping up with current assignments, was nearly impossible. I was still recovering from mono and getting tired easily, but now I had to do double the work just to stay in my grade. I spent every evening and weekend for the next month and a half doing nothing but schoolwork, barely sleeping, and stressing about deadlines. Some teachers were understanding and gave me reasonable extensions. Others seemed to enjoy piling on extra work and refusing to offer any flexibility. My chemistry teacher actually told me that being sick was my problem, and I should have planned better. How exactly was I supposed to plan not to get mono? I did eventually make up all the work, but my grades suffered because I was so overwhelmed and exhausted. I went from being an A student to barely maintaining B's and C's. The whole experience taught me that schools care more about attendance statistics and policies than they do about students' actual well-being or circumstances. What really made me angry was finding out later that another student in my grade had missed 3 weeks for a family vacation to Europe and faced 0 consequences. Apparently, his parents had just told the school it was an educational trip and that was good enough. So missing school for an illness I couldn't control almost got me held back, but missing school for vacation was totally fine. That's the end of that story. The hypocrisy of punishing a sick kid while letting vacation absences slide shows exactly where the school's priorities were. Principal Harris was more interested in flexing his authority than actually helping a student deal with a medical crisis. Some administrators really do forget that policies should serve students, not the other way around. Moving into our next story, this one shows how quickly teachers can turn on you when you don't fit their expectations. I had this English teacher in 8th grade named Miss Chen, who was obsessed with creative writing. Every week, we'd have these writing assignments where we were supposed to write short stories or personal essays about our experiences. I've never been great at creative writing because I'm more of a math and science person, but I tried my best. The problem started when Miss Chen decided that my writing was too boring. She'd write comments on my papers like, "Where's the emotion?" and "This reads like a technical manual," and "Try to make the reader feel something." I was writing about real things that happened to me, but apparently they weren't dramatic enough for her taste. One assignment asked us to write about a challenge we'd overcome. I wrote about learning to ride a bike when I was 7, which I thought was a perfectly fine topic. Miss Chen gave me a D and wrote that the story lacked depth and emotional resonance. Meanwhile, she gave my classmate an A for a story that was clearly made up about surviving a shark attack. After getting several bad grades, I decided to try a different approach. For the next assignment about a memorable day, I completely made up this elaborate story about getting lost in the woods during a camping trip and having to survive overnight by myself. I added all this dramatic stuff about being scared and cold and hungry, none of which actually happened because I'd never even been camping. Miss Chen loved it. She gave me an A+ and read parts of it aloud to the class as an example of excellent descriptive writing. She praised how I'd made the reader feel my fear and isolation. I felt like such a fraud because the whole thing was completely fictional, but apparently that's what she wanted. From then on, I just made up increasingly ridiculous stories for every assignment. I wrote about saving a drowning kid at the beach, even though I've never been to a beach. I wrote about standing up to a bully, even though I'd never witnessed bullying. I wrote about my grandmother's death, even though all my grandparents are still alive. Miss Chen ate it all up, and my grade in the class went from a C to an A. She even nominated one of my completely fabricated essays for some kind of school writing award. The whole thing felt wrong, but I needed the grade, and she'd made it clear that honest, straightforward writing wasn't what she wanted. That's the end of that story. Miss Chen taught me that sometimes teachers reward performance over authenticity. She wanted drama and emotion regardless of truth, which is pretty messed up for someone who's supposed to be teaching students to value honest expression. Some educators care more about entertaining writing than genuine communication. This next story is absolutely infuriating because it shows how one person's jealousy can destroy months of hard work. I was really into robotics during my junior year of high school, and our school had just started a robotics club that would compete in regional competitions. I was one of the founding members, along with about 8 other students who were interested in engineering and programming. We met twice a week after school to work on building our robot for the upcoming competition. The competition required teams to build a robot that could complete specific tasks, like picking up objects, navigating obstacles, and scoring points by placing items in designated zones. We had about 4 months to design, build, program, and test our robot before the regional event. I ended up taking on a lot of responsibility in the club because I'd been teaching myself programming and electronics for years. I wasn't trying to be bossy or take over, but I had more experience than most of the other members, so I naturally ended up leading a lot of the technical work. Our club advisor, Mr. Thompson, was a physics teacher who was supportive but didn't know much about robotics, so he mostly let us figure things out ourselves. Everything was going great until this kid named Brandon joined the club about 6 weeks in. He'd heard we were doing well and wanted to be part of it. We welcomed him and tried to get him caught up on what we'd already built and what still needed to be done. Brandon seemed enthusiastic at first and said he wanted to help with programming. The problem was that Brandon didn't actually know how to program. When I tried to teach him some basics and give him small tasks to work on, he'd get frustrated and say I was being condescending. He wanted to work on the important stuff right away, without learning the fundamentals first. Brandon started complaining to other club members that I was hogging all the interesting work and not letting anyone else contribute. This wasn't true at all. I'd been dividing up tasks based on people's skills and interests, and everyone else seemed happy with their roles. But Brandon convinced a few members that I was being controlling and trying to take all the credit. Things came to a head about 2 weeks before the competition. We were doing final testing on the robot, and everything was working perfectly. We'd run through the competition tasks dozens of times, and our robot was performing better than we'd hoped. The team was excited and confident. Then one afternoon, I came to the robotics lab after school and found Brandon there alone with the robot. He said he'd been trying to improve the programming to make it faster. I asked him not to change anything without discussing it with the team first, since we were so close to competition and didn't want to risk breaking something that was working. Brandon got defensive and said I didn't own the robot, and he had just as much right to work on it as anyone. I tried to explain that it wasn't about ownership. It was about making sure changes were tested and documented so we didn't introduce bugs. He stormed out, saying I was proving his point about being controlling. The next day, our robot didn't work at all. When I examined the code, I found that Brandon had completely rewritten major sections of the programming. His code was full of errors and logic problems that made the robot behave erratically. It would start tasks and then stop randomly, or try to move in the wrong direction, or just freeze completely. I spent the entire weekend trying to restore the original code and fix the damage Brandon had done. We had backups, but his changes had somehow corrupted some of the core functions, and I had to rebuild large portions from scratch. I barely slept for 3 days straight, surviving on energy drinks and desperation. By Monday, I'd gotten the robot mostly working again, but it wasn't as reliable as it had been before Brandon messed with it. We had less than a week until competition, and still needed to do more testing. When I explained to the club what had happened, Brandon denied that his changes had broken anything. He said I probably broke it myself and was blaming him. Some club members believed him, especially the ones he'd already turned against me. They said I was making excuses because I couldn't handle someone else contributing to the programming. Mr. Thompson didn't know enough about the technical details to judge who was telling the truth, so he just said we needed to work together and focus on getting ready for competition. We went to the regional competition with a robot that worked about 70%, as well as it had before Brandon's interference. We placed 9th out of 15 teams, which wasn't terrible, but we'd been on track to place in the top 3 before everything got sabotaged. The worst part was that Brandon took credit for the programming work at the competition, telling judges and other teams about features that I had actually coded months before he even joined the club. He acted like he'd been a major contributor when he'd actually nearly destroyed everything we'd built. After the competition, several club members quit because they were tired of the drama. Brandon stayed and continued to act like he was some kind of robotics expert, even though he still couldn't write basic code without making errors. I stopped putting in as much effort because I realized that working hard just meant having more to lose when someone decided to sabotage it. That's the end of that story. Brandon's ego and incompetence destroyed what should have been a proud achievement for our whole team. He couldn't handle not being the star, so he sabotaged months of collective work and then tried to take credit for what remained. Some people really will burn down everyone else's success, rather than put in the work to earn their own. Let's move to this next story that shows how unfair dress code enforcement can be. My school had this dress code that was supposed to apply equally to everyone, but in reality, it was enforced way more strictly on girls than guys. The official policy said no shorts or skirts shorter than fingertip length, no tank tops, no ripped jeans, no hats, and nothing with offensive language or images. During the spring of my freshman year, it started getting really hot, like mid-80s to low 90s every day. The school had air conditioning, but it was old and didn't work well, so classrooms would get stuffy and uncomfortable. Lots of students started wearing shorts and short sleeves to stay cool. I noticed that girls were constantly getting dress coded for wearing shorts that were maybe an inch above fingertip length, while guys could wear whatever and nobody said anything. The assistant principal, Miss Williams, would literally patrol the hallways with a ruler measuring girls' shorts and skirts. If you were even slightly too short, you'd get sent home to change or have to wear these hideous gym shorts for the rest of the day. One day, my friend Sarah got dress coded for wearing a tank top that showed her shoulders. The same day, guys on the basketball team were walking around in sleeveless jerseys that showed way more skin, and nobody said anything to them. When Sarah pointed this out, Miss Williams said that girls' clothing was more distracting and needed stricter enforcement. The double standard was so obvious that a group of girls decided to protest by documenting every dress code violation they saw guys getting away with. Over 1 week, they photographed dozens of guys wearing ripped jeans with holes above the knee, shorts that were clearly shorter than fingertip length, and tank tops showing their shoulders and sides. None of them had been dress coded. The girls presented this evidence to Principal Davis and demanded that either the dress code be enforced equally or changed completely. Principal Davis got defensive and said that the dress code was gender neutral and applied to everyone the same. When the girls showed him the photographic evidence of unequal enforcement, he said that staff couldn't catch every violation and were doing their best. The situation escalated when about 30 girls showed up to school one Monday, all wearing outfits that technically followed the dress code but clearly pushed the boundaries. They'd measured everything to be exactly at fingertip length or longer, made sure their shoulders were covered, and avoided anything with offensive images. But they all wore bright colours and attention-getting styles. Miss Williams went ballistic and tried to dress code almost all of them for various made-up reasons. She said some girls' clothing was too tight, others were too distracting, and some were violating the spirit of the dress code even if they technically followed the rules. She sent about 15 girls to the office, creating chaos because there weren't enough spare gym clothes for everyone. Parents started getting involved, and several threatened legal action over gender-based discrimination in dress code enforcement. The school board got pressured to review the policy, and after several heated meetings, they revised the dress code to be more specific. and required staff to document all dress code violations to ensure equal enforcement. Miss Williams was furious about the changes and made her resentment obvious for the rest of the year. She'd make snide comments about girls' clothing choices and act like the revised dress code was making her job impossible. That's the end of that story. The fact that it took a coordinated protest and threat of legal action to get equal enforcement shows how ingrained the double standard was. Miss Williams was more interested in policing girls' bodies than actually maintaining reasonable dress standards for everyone. Some school staff really do let their personal biases override basic fairness. This next story demonstrates how quickly your reputation can be destroyed by something completely out of your control. I was in 11th grade taking AP United States History, which was known for being one of the hardest classes in our school. The teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, was really strict about academic integrity and would fail anyone he caught cheating. He'd give this speech at the beginning of the year about how cheating was the worst thing a student could do and how he had zero tolerance for it. We had a major test coming up, covering about 6 chapters of material on the Civil War and Reconstruction. I studied for probably 2 weeks, making flashcards, reading the chapters multiple times, and doing practice questions. I really wanted to do well, because the test was worth 25% of our semester grade. The day of the test, I felt pretty prepared. Mr. Rodriguez had arranged the desks in this staggered pattern so people couldn't easily see each other's papers. I sat down, got my test, and started working through the questions. It was hard, but I felt like I knew most of the answers. About halfway through the test period, Mr. Rodriguez walked up to my desk and quietly asked me to come to the hallway. I was confused but followed him out. Once we were in the hallway, he held up his phone and showed me a photo. It was a picture of the test answer key, and the photo had been sent from my phone number. I was completely shocked and told him I had no idea what he was talking about. My phone was in my locker like it was supposed to be during tests. Mr. Rodriguez said he'd received the photo about 10 minutes into the test period and it had come from my number. Someone had sent him a picture of the answer key, presumably thinking they were sending it to a friend to help them cheat, but had accidentally sent it to him instead. I kept insisting that I hadn't sent anything because my phone was in my locker. Mr. Rodriguez said we'd go check my locker together. We went to the hallway where lockers were, and I opened mine. My phone was sitting right there where I'd left it. I picked it up and checked the sent messages. There was a sent message to Mr. Rodriguez's number with a photo of the test answer key, sent at exactly the time he said. I was panicking because I had absolutely no explanation for how this could have happened. I hadn't sent that message. I hadn't even had my phone. But the evidence was right there on my phone showing that I'd sent the photo. Mr. Rodriguez took me to the principal's office and explained the situation. I kept saying I didn't do it, but I couldn't explain the evidence. Principal Martinez asked if anyone else had my phone password, and I said no. He asked if I'd left my phone unlocked, and I said I always locked it. The more I tried to explain that it wasn't me, the more guilty I sounded. They ended up giving me a 0 on the test and a 3-day suspension for academic dishonesty. The suspension would go on my permanent record, which I was terrified would affect my college applications. My parents were furious at me, and I couldn't make them understand that I genuinely hadn't sent that message. It wasn't until about a week later that the truth came out. Another student in the class, a kid named Tyler, confessed to what he'd done. He'd figured out that if you had someone's phone number, you could use various apps and services to send texts that appeared to come from that number. He'd done it as a prank, thinking it would be funny to make it look like I'd sent the answer key to the teacher. Tyler apparently didn't realize how serious the consequences would be. He thought I'd just get in minor trouble, and then we'd all laugh about it later. When he found out I'd gotten suspended and the incident was on my permanent record, he felt guilty and confessed. The school reversed the suspension and removed it from my record, but the damage was done. Everyone knew I'd been accused of cheating, and a lot of students didn't hear about or didn't believe the explanation that it had been a prank. For the rest of the year, I'd hear whispers about how I'd tried to cheat on the A-push test. Mr. Rodriguez apologized, but it felt hollow because he'd been so quick to assume I was guilty without considering other possibilities. He'd seen the evidence and immediately concluded I was a cheater rather than thinking about whether there might be another explanation. Tyler got suspended for 2 weeks for the prank, but in my opinion, that wasn't nearly enough punishment for what he'd done. He'd nearly destroyed my academic reputation and could have affected my college prospects just for a laugh. He apologized, but I never forgave him because some things aren't fixable with a simple sorry. That's the end of that story. The fact that Tyler thought ruining someone's reputation would be funny shows a complete lack of empathy and understanding of consequences. Mr. Rodriguez's rush to judgment without investigating other possibilities created a situation where an innocent student got punished for something they didn't do. Some pranks aren't pranks at all, they're just cruel. Moving into this next story about how teachers can play favorites in ways that completely undermine fairness. I was taking chemistry during my sophomore year with Mrs. Palmer, and right from the start, it was obvious she had favorite students. There were about 5 kids in the class who could do no wrong in her eyes, and everyone else was held to much stricter standards. Her favorites were mostly students who participated a lot in class discussions and laughed at her jokes. They weren't necessarily the smartest kids or the hardest workers, just the ones who were good at making Mrs. Palmer feel appreciated and entertaining. The favoritism showed up in all kinds of ways. When her favorite students turned in assignments late, she'd accept them with no penalty. When other students asked for extensions, she'd say no and dock points for lateness. When favorites made mistakes on labs, she'd help them fix their errors and give them full credit. When other students made the same mistakes, she'd mark them down and say they should have been more careful. The most obvious example was this kid named Josh, who was definitely one of her favorites. Josh was charming and funny, but he was not great at chemistry. He'd regularly show up to class without having done the homework or reading, but Mrs. Palmer would just laugh it off and say something like, "Oh Josh, you're hopeless," in this affectionate way. Meanwhile, I was working really hard in the class, doing all the homework, studying for tests, and trying to understand the material. But I was quieter and didn't participate in the social dynamic that Mrs. Palmer seemed to enjoy. I'd answer questions when called on, but didn't volunteer constantly or try to entertain the class. We had this major project where we had to design and conduct our own experiment, write up the results, and present to the class. I spent weeks planning my experiment, carefully controlling variables, and documenting everything thoroughly. My presentation was detailed and showed all my data and analysis. Josh clearly threw his project together at the last minute. His experiment had obvious flaws in the design, his data didn't make sense, and his presentation was about 5 minutes of rambling with minimal actual content. But when Mrs. Palmer graded the projects, Josh got an A- and I got a B+. I asked to meet with her to discuss my grade, and she said my project was good but lacked creativity. When I pointed out that Josh's project had fundamental scientific problems, she said that his creative approach and presentation skills compensated for technical weaknesses. Apparently, entertainment value was more important than actual chemistry. The unfairness continued throughout the semester. I'd study hard for tests and get B's, while Josh would admit to barely studying and get A's. When I looked at his tests after they were returned, I could see that Mrs. Palmer had given him partial credit for answers that were clearly wrong, while she'd marked me down for minor errors. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Several other students complained about how obviously biased her grading was. But Mrs. Palmer would just say that she graded based on overall understanding and participation, not just test scores, which was convenient for her favorites who didn't test well. By the end of the semester, I'd worked harder in chemistry than any other class, and ended up with a B, while Josh coasted through with minimal effort and got an A. The grade difference affected my GPA and class ranking, which was frustrating because it wasn't based on actual performance or understanding of the material. That's the end of that story. Mrs. Palmer's favoritism rewarded personality over performance and destroyed any sense of fairness in how students were evaluated. Josh learned that charm could substitute for effort, while hard-working students learned that their work didn't matter as much as their ability to entertain the teacher. Some educators really do fail their students by letting personal preferences override objective evaluation. This next story shows how one malicious person can turn an entire friend group against you. I had this really close group of friends during freshman year. There were 6 of us who'd met during orientation and clicked immediately. We did everything together, ate lunch at the same table every day, hung out on weekends, and had this group chat that was constantly active. I genuinely thought these were friendships that would last through high school and beyond. One of the people in our group was this girl named Ashley. She was fun and outgoing, but I started noticing that she had this need to be the center of attention. If someone else was getting more attention than her, she'd find ways to redirect focus back to herself. At first, I thought it was just her personality and didn't think much of it. Things started changing around October. I'd gotten the lead role in the school play, which was exciting for me because I'd never done theatre before. My friends were supportive and said they'd come to the performances. Ashley congratulated me, but seemed less enthusiastic than the others. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Ashley making small negative comments about the play. She'd say things like, "Aren't you worried you'll embarrass yourself on stage?" Or, "I could never do theatre. It's so attention-seeking." The comments were subtle enough that I couldn't call her out without seeming oversensitive. Then, I started noticing that the group chat would have long conversations that I wasn't included in. They'd reference inside jokes I didn't know about and talk about things they'd done together without mentioning that I hadn't been invited. When I asked about it, they'd say it had been last-minute plans, or they thought I was too busy with play rehearsals. Ashley was always the one organising these hangouts that I wasn't invited to. She'd message the group chat when she knew I was at rehearsal, and by the time I saw the messages, plans would already be made. It seemed calculated to exclude me while making it look casual. I tried talking to my friend Melissa about feeling left out, and she said I was probably just stressed from the play and imagining things. But the exclusion continued and got more obvious. They'd all show up to school wearing matching shirts they'd apparently designed together at someone's house the weekend before. Nobody had mentioned it to me. The final blow came the night of the play's opening performance. I was nervous but excited, and I'd been looking forward to seeing my friends in the audience. During intermission, I peeked out from backstage to see where they were sitting. They weren't there. None of them had come. After the performance, I checked my phone and found a message in the group chat from Ashley saying she'd organised a bowling night for everyone and they were having an amazing time. She'd deliberately planned it for the same night as my play and convinced everyone else to skip my performance. When I confronted the group about it, Ashley acted innocent and said she'd forgotten what night the play was on. The others backed her up and said it was just an unfortunate scheduling conflict. But I knew Ashley had known exactly when the play was. We'd talked about it multiple times. I realised that Ashley had been systematically poisoning my friendships, probably because she was jealous of the attention I was getting from the play. She'd been spreading the narrative that I was too busy and full of myself to care about the friend group anymore. By the time I figured out what she was doing, everyone else already believed her version of events. I tried to rebuild individual friendships with people from the group, but Ashley had done her work too well. They all believed I'd changed and become self-absorbed. By the end of the year, I'd essentially lost the entire friend group and had to start over building new friendships. That's the end of that story. Ashley's manipulation was calculated and effective, turning friends against each other through subtle undermining and strategic exclusion. She couldn't handle someone else getting attention, so she destroyed their friendships to maintain her position as the center of the social circle. Some people really are that insecure and malicious. Let's finish with this story that shows how administrative incompetence can create nightmares for students trying to follow the rules. During my junior year, I decided to take an extra class through through the school's online learning program. The program allowed students to take classes that weren't offered at our school or to get ahead on credits. I wanted to take AP Psychology, which our school didn't offer in person, so I signed up for the online version. The process was supposed to be simple. I'd fill out an application, get it approved by my guidance counsellor, and then access the online course through a portal. The school would receive my grades and add them to my transcript, just like any other class. I submitted my application in March for the course that would start in September. My guidance counsellor, Mr. Stevens, approved it and said everything was set up. I got a confirmation email over the summer saying I was enrolled and could start the course when school began in the fall. September arrived, and I tried to log in to the online portal to start my AP Psychology course. The login credentials I'd been sent didn't work. I emailed the online learning coordinator and got an automated response saying they'd get back to me within 3 to 5 business days. A week went by with no response. I went to Mr. Stevens and explained that I couldn't access the course. He said he'd look into it and told me not to worry. Another week passed, and I still couldn't log in. I was starting to get anxious because the course had already been going for 2 weeks, and I was missing assignments. Finally, I got an email from the online learning program saying there was no record of my enrollment. They had no application from me, no payment, and no account under my name. I forwarded this to Mr. Stevens, who seemed confused and said he'd definitely approved my application back in March. After some investigation, we discovered that Mr. Stevens had approved my application, but never actually submitted it to the online learning program. He'd kept it in his to-do pile for months and forgotten about it. The confirmation email I'd received had been sent to me by mistake because of a database error. Mr. Stevens apologized and said he'd try to get me enrolled immediately, but the online program said that enrollment for the fall semester was closed and I'd have to wait until January to start the course. This meant I'd be a full semester behind schedule. I explained that I'd been planning to take AP Psychology in the fall and another online course in the spring, and this delay would mess up my entire schedule. Mr. Stevens said there was nothing he could do and I'd just have to adjust my plans. The problem got worse when I realized that because I wasn't taking AP Psychology, I had a free period in my schedule that I hadn't planned for. The school required juniors to have at least 6 classes per semester, and I only had 5 now. Mr. Stevens said I'd need to add another class to meet the requirement, but it was already 3 weeks into the semester, and most classes were full or had moved past the point where a new student could reasonably catch up. The only available classes were ones that conflicted with my existing schedule or were courses I'd already taken. I ended up having to take a class called Life Skills that was basically a blow-off course for students who needed easy credits. It was mind-numbingly boring and a complete waste of time, but it was the only option that fit my schedule and met the school's requirements. The whole situation meant that instead of taking 2 challenging AP courses like I'd planned, I spent junior year taking 1 AP course and a pointless life skills class. This affected my course rigor for college applications and wasted time I could have spent on meaningful learning. Mr. Stevens never faced any consequences for forgetting to submit my application. He apologized a few times, but seemed to think it was just an unfortunate mistake. The school administration didn't hold him accountable or offer any compensation for the problems his error caused. I ended up taking AP Psychology during senior year, which was fine, but it threw off my original plan for which AP courses to take when, all because a guidance counsellor couldn't be bothered to follow through on a simple administrative task. That's the end of that story. Mr. Stevens's incompetence derailed a student's carefully planned academic schedule, and he faced no consequences for it. The school system prioritized covering for staff mistakes over making things right for the student who'd done everything correctly. Some administrators really do fail students through sheer carelessness and then act like apologies are sufficient compensation. Now, this next story shows how one teacher's carelessness can completely derail your academic achievements. I was in my junior year taking AP Literature, and we had this massive research paper assignment that was worth 40% of our semester grade. Mrs. Anderson gave us the entire semester to work on it, from September through December, with the final paper due right before winter break. The assignment was to write a 12 to 15-page research paper, analysing a major work of American literature through a critical lens of our choice. I chose to write about The Great Gatsby using a Marxist critical approach, looking at class conflict and the American dream. I was actually really excited about it because I loved the book and had some interesting ideas about economic inequality in the novel. I spent the entire semester working on this paper. I read The Great Gatsby 3 times, took pages and pages of notes, read probably 20 different critical essays and scholarly articles, and wrote multiple drafts. I met with Mrs. Anderson during her office hours at least 5 times to discuss my thesis and get feedback on my arguments. She seemed impressed with my work and said I was on track for an excellent paper. I finished my final draft 2 days before the deadline and spent hours proofreading it, checking all my citations and making sure the formatting was perfect. The paper ended up being 14 pages long, had over 30 sources in the bibliography, and I was genuinely proud of it. I thought it was some of the best academic writing I'd ever done. The day it was due, I printed out 2 copies, one to turn in and one to keep for my records. I put the copy I was turning in inside a folder with my name clearly labelled on the front and handed it directly to Mrs. Anderson at the end of class. She took it, added it to a stack of other papers on her desk, and said she'd have them all graded by mid-January. January came around after winter break, and Mrs. Anderson still hadn't returned our papers. She kept saying she was working on grading them, but they were taking longer than expected because there were so many and they were all so long. By the end of January, students were getting anxious because our semester grades had to be finalised soon. Finally, in early February, Mrs. Anderson started returning papers. One by one, students got their research papers back, with grades and detailed comments. But when everyone else had gotten theirs back, I still hadn't received mine. I asked Mrs. Anderson about it after class, and she said she'd look for it. The next day, she told me she couldn't find my paper. She'd looked through all the papers she'd graded, and all the ones still waiting to be graded, and mine wasn't there. She asked if I was sure I'd turned it in. I told her absolutely. I'd handed it directly to her on the due date and watched her put it on her desk. Mrs. Anderson said that if I couldn't produce the paper, she'd have to give me a 0 for the assignment, which would mean failing the class for the semester. I was panicking. I told her I had a copy at home that I could bring in to prove I'd written the paper. She said that wouldn't work because I could have written it any time, and there was no way to prove I'd completed it by the original deadline. I begged her to check her desk again, her filing cabinets, anywhere the paper might have ended up. She said she'd already looked everywhere, and it simply wasn't there. She suggested that maybe I hadn't actually turned it in, and was misremembering. I insisted that I had definitely, absolutely turned it in, and she'd even commented on how thick my folder was when I handed it to her. The situation got worse when Mrs. Anderson said that her policy was that students were responsible for making sure their work was properly submitted and received. She said that if I'd really turned it in, I should have gotten confirmation from her that she'd received it and recorded it. But that wasn't her policy at all. She'd never told us we needed to get written confirmation of submission. My parents got involved and scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Anderson and the principal. During the meeting, I brought my personal copy of the paper to show that I had definitely written it. Mrs. Anderson looked through it and admitted that it was excellent work, but she maintained that without proof I'd turned it in on time, she couldn't give me credit. My mum asked why Mrs. Anderson's disorganisation should result in me failing the class when I'd clearly done the work. The principal said it was a difficult situation, but that, ultimately, it was the students' responsibility to ensure assignments were properly submitted. I suggested that Mrs. Anderson could look at the metadata on my computer file to see when the document was last modified, which would prove I'd finished it before the deadline. The principal said that metadata could be manipulated and wouldn't be accepted as proof. I felt like I was in a Kafka novel where no evidence would ever be good enough. Eventually, after my parents threatened to go to the school board and possibly pursue legal action, the principal and Mrs. Anderson agreed on a compromise. I would be allowed to resubmit the paper, but my maximum possible grade would be a B- because of the late submission. Even though it wasn't actually late, and even though the reason I was resubmitting was that Mrs. Anderson had lost the original, I was furious about the unfairness. But my parents advised me to take the compromise rather than risk getting a 0. So I resubmitted my paper, and Mrs. Anderson gave me exactly a B-, the maximum allowed under the compromise. She wrote on it that the analysis was sophisticated and well-researched, but the grade was reduced due to late submission. That B- brought my semester grade down to a B+ when I should have gotten an A. It affected my GPA and class ranking, all because a teacher lost my paper and then blamed me for her mistake. The most frustrating part was that Mrs. Anderson never apologized or acknowledged that she might have misplaced my work. She maintained that the most likely explanation was that I hadn't actually turned it in. For the rest of the year, I made sure to email teachers copies of every assignment in addition to turning in physical copies. I'd learned that you can do everything right and still get screwed over when adults refuse to take responsibility for their own errors. That's the end of that story. Mrs. Anderson's refusal to admit she'd lost a student's work, combined with the administration's unwillingness to hold her accountable, shows exactly how schools protect teachers at students' expense. She lost months of someone's hard work and then punished them for it rather than taking responsibility. Some educators really do prioritize covering their own mistakes over treating students fairly. This next story shows how jealousy can make people destroy what they can't have. I was really into photography during my sophomore and junior years. I'd saved up money from working summer jobs to buy a decent camera and some lenses, and I spent all my free time taking photos and learning about composition and lighting. It was the one thing I felt like I was genuinely good at. Our school had a photography club that met once a week, and we'd share our work and give each other feedback. The club advisor, Mr. Chen, was an art teacher who was really supportive and would help us improve our skills. At the end of each semester, the club would put together an exhibition of our best work to display in the school's main hallway. I'd been working on this series of photos all semester for the exhibition. They were black and white portraits of different people in our community, like the janitor at our school, the woman who ran the corner store near campus, the crossing guard, people that everyone saw every day but never really noticed. I'd spent hours talking to each person, learning their stories and trying to capture something meaningful about them in the photos. The series ended up being 12 portraits, and I was really proud of how they'd turned out. Each photo had this quality where you felt like you were really seeing the person, not just what they looked like, but who they were. Mr. Chen said they were the best work anyone in the photography club had done in years. There was this other girl in the club, named Vanessa, who was also really serious about photography. Her work was good, very technically skilled, but it was more conventional. She'd do landscapes and still lifes and macro shots of flowers, all very pretty but not particularly original or meaningful. Vanessa had been acting weird around me for weeks, making passive-aggressive comments about my portrait series. She'd say things like, "It must be nice to have so much free time to work on projects," or "Some people just have natural talent, I guess," in this bitter tone. I tried to ignore it and figured she was just stressed about her own work. The day before the exhibition was supposed to go up, I brought all 12 of my framed portraits to school to give to Mr. Chen. The frames had cost me almost $200, which was a lot of money for me, but I wanted the presentation to be professional. I left them in the photography club room in a portfolio case, with my name clearly labelled on it. The next morning, I came to school early to help set up the exhibition. When I got to the photography club room to get my portraits, I found my portfolio case lying open on the floor. All 12 of my framed photographs were ruined. Someone had taken a knife or scissors and slashed through each print, completely destroying them. The frames were also damaged, with broken glass and bent corners. I was absolutely devastated. Months of work, hundreds of dollars in materials and printing costs, all destroyed. I stood there, staring at the ruined photos, and just started crying. Mr. Chen came in and found me sitting on the floor, surrounded by the shredded remains of my portraits. We went to the principal's office immediately to report what had happened. The school said they'd investigate, but since it had happened after hours when nobody was supposed to be in the building, there were no witnesses. The photography club room didn't have security cameras, so there was no way to see who'd done it. I knew it was Vanessa. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. The way she'd been acting, the timing right before the exhibition, everything pointed to her. When I suggested this to the principal, she said they couldn't accuse students without evidence, and that it could have been anyone with access to the building. The exhibition went up without my portraits. Vanessa's conventional landscape photos were prominently displayed, and people complimented them. She acted sympathetic about what had happened to my work, saying how terrible it was that someone would do such a thing. But I could see this look in her eyes that was almost satisfied. I tried to recreate the portraits from my digital files, but it wasn't the same. Some of the people I'd photographed had moved away or weren't available to sign new release forms. The whole magic of the series was lost because I'd moved on emotionally and couldn't recapture what I'd felt when I took the original photos. The school investigation went nowhere. They questioned students who had access to the building after hours, but everyone denied knowing anything about it. Vanessa was never even formally questioned because there was no evidence connecting her to the vandalism. What hurt the most wasn't just the destroyed work. It was knowing that someone had been so jealous and malicious that they'd rather destroy something beautiful than let someone else succeed. Whoever did it didn't gain anything from ruining my portraits except the satisfaction of hurting me. I stopped being as active in photography club after that. The joy I'd felt in creating work and sharing it with others was poisoned by the knowledge that someone might destroy it out of spite. I became more protective of my work and stopped bringing my best stuff to school. Years later, I heard through mutual friends that Vanessa had admitted to a college roommate that she'd destroyed someone's photography project in high school because she was jealous they were getting more attention than her. The roommate thought it was terrible and stopped being friends with her, but that confession came way too late to matter or to get me any kind of justice. That's the end of that story. Vanessa's jealousy was so toxic that she destroyed months of someone else's work rather than deal with her own insecurity. She got away with it completely, and even got to have her work prominently displayed in the exhibition that should have featured the portraits she'd destroyed. Some people really will burn down everything around them rather than accept that others might be more talented. Moving to this next story about how schools can punish students for things that happen off campus. I was in 10th grade when I got involved in this whole mess that started with a group chat. A bunch of kids from my class had created a group chat over the summer to talk about random stuff, share memes, and make plans to hang out. It was pretty harmless at first, just typical teenage nonsense. But over time, the chat started getting meaner. People would screenshot conversations from other group chats and share them to make fun of what people had said. They'd post unflattering photos of classmates and add mocking captions. It went from being a fun social thing to being basically a gossip and bullying platform. I didn't participate in the mean stuff, but I also didn't leave the group chat or speak up against it. I'd just mute the notifications and ignore most of the messages. I know now that staying silent made me complicit, but at the time, I convinced myself that as long as I wasn't actively being mean, I wasn't part of the problem. Things escalated when someone in the chat started posting really nasty stuff about this girl named Rachel who was in our grade. They were calling her horrible names, making up rumours about her, and encouraging others to exclude her socially. It was cruel and targeted, and it went on for several days. I felt bad, about what was happening to Rachel, but I still didn't say anything or leave the group. I told myself it wasn't my business, and I didn't want to become a target myself by defending her. It was cowardly, and I knew it even then. Someone eventually showed Rachel the messages from the group chat. She was devastated and told her parents, who contacted the school. The school demanded that every student in the group chat turn over their phones so administrators could see the messages. This is where things got complicated. The group chat had happened entirely outside of school, on our personal phones, discussing non-school stuff. A lot of students and parents argued that the school had no right to punish kids for what they said in their private conversations off campus. But the school said that because the bullying affected Rachel's ability to feel safe at school, they had jurisdiction to address it. They went through everyone's phones and identified the students who had posted the worst messages about Rachel. About 8 kids got suspended for various lengths of time, depending on how much they'd participated in the bullying. Some got 3 days, others got a full week. But here's the thing. The school also punished everyone who'd been in the group chat but hadn't spoken up against the bullying. I got called to the principal's office, along with about 15 other students who'd been in the chat but hadn't posted anything mean. Principal Hawkins said that by remaining in the group and not reporting the bullying, we'd created an environment that enabled it to continue. He said we had a responsibility to either stop the behaviour or report it to adults. We all got 2 days of detention and had to attend mandatory sessions about bullying and being an upstander instead of a bystander. Our parents were also called in for meetings about our role in creating a hostile environment for Rachel. A lot of parents were furious and argued that the school was overstepping its authority. My dad pointed out that I hadn't actually said anything mean and shouldn't be punished for other people's actions. Principal Hawkins said that silence in the face of bullying was a choice, and it was a choice that had consequences. The whole situation divided the school. Some people thought the punishments were appropriate and that everyone who'd witnessed the bullying should be held accountable. Others thought the school was violating students' privacy and free speech by punishing them for off-campus conversations. For me, the detention was embarrassing but not the worst part. The worst part was having to face Rachel, knowing that I'd seen people saying terrible things about her and done nothing. During one of our mandatory sessions, we had to hear from Rachel about how the bullying had affected her. She talked about feeling afraid to come to school, crying herself to sleep, and wondering what she'd done to make people hate her so much. I apologized to her after the session, but it felt inadequate. I hadn't personally attacked her, but I'd been part of the audience that made the attackers feel like what they were doing was acceptable. My silence had been a kind of permission. The experience taught me that staying neutral in situations of injustice means siding with the oppressor. It also taught me that the line between school and non-school life isn't as clear as people think. What happens in group chats and on social media doesn't stay separate from what happens in hallways and classrooms. I still think about whether the school was right to punish students for off-campus speech. Part of me agrees that they overstepped their authority, but another part of me thinks that someone needed to send a message that being a passive observer to cruelty is still being part of the problem. That's the end of that story. The school's decision to punish bystanders, along with active participants, was controversial, but it forced students to confront their complicity in creating a culture of bullying. Whether schools should regulate off-campus speech is complicated, but watching someone get destroyed in a group chat and doing nothing about it definitely makes you part of the problem. This next story is about a coach who took competition way too seriously. I joined the track team during my freshman year because I'd always been a decent runner and thought it would be fun to compete. Our coach, Coach Mitchell, had a reputation for being intense, but I figured all coaches were like that. I had no idea what I was getting into. Coach Mitchell was obsessed with winning. He'd been coaching track for 15 years and was proud of the fact that our school's team had won the regional championship 7 times under his leadership. Every practice, every meet, everything was about maintaining that winning tradition. At first, His intensity seemed motivating. He'd push us hard during practice, but I thought that was just what serious athletic training looked like. He'd yell encouragement and challenge us to beat our personal records. Some of it felt over the top, but most of the team seemed to respond well to his coaching style. Things started feeling wrong during my sophomore year. I'd gotten pretty good at the 800-meter race and was consistently placing in meets. Coach Mitchell started paying more attention to me and pushing me harder than the other runners. He said I had potential to be great if I was willing to make sacrifices. The sacrifices he wanted me to make started small. He wanted me running extra miles before school started. Then he wanted me to change my diet, cutting out basically anything that wasn't lean protein and vegetables. He'd question what I ate at lunch and make comments if he thought I was making bad nutritional choices. Then he started getting involved in other aspects of my life. He said I should quit the jazz band because rehearsals were taking time away from training. He suggested I should reconsider taking AP classes because the stress and homework load might affect my performance. He wanted track to be my entire life. When I pushed back and said I wanted to maintain balance with other activities and academics, Coach Mitchell got angry. He said that if I wasn't willing to commit fully to the team, I was letting everyone down. He said that serious athletes made sacrifices, and that I was showing I wasn't serious. The worst incident happened during my junior year at the regional championship meet. I was running the 800 and was having a great race, on pace to set a personal record. Coming around the final turn, I was in second place, about 20 meters behind the leader. As I came down the final straight, I started feeling really dizzy and my vision got blurry. I could tell something was wrong with my body, but I kept running because Coach Mitchell had always told us that pain was just weakness, leaving the body, and we had to push through it. I ended up collapsing about 50 meters from the finish line. I literally fell forward onto the track and couldn't get up. My legs wouldn't work and everything was spinning. Medical staff came over and took me to the emergency tent. Turns out I was severely dehydrated and had early signs of heat exhaustion. The temperature that day was in the mid-90s, and I hadn't been drinking enough water because Coach Mitchell had told us that drinking too much during races would slow us down. While I was in the medical tent getting IV fluids, Coach Mitchell came in and started yelling at me. He was furious that I'd quit the race and cost the team points. He said I should have finished before collapsing, that collapsing after the finish line would have at least gotten us second place points. The medical staff told him to leave and that his advice about limiting water intake during hot weather was dangerous and potentially life-threatening. Coach Mitchell left, but later he blamed me for embarrassing the team by not finishing the race. My parents were horrified when they found out what had happened. They met with the athletic director and demanded that Coach Mitchell be held accountable for giving dangerous advice about hydration. The athletic director said they'd talked to Coach Mitchell about updating his coaching methods, but nothing really changed. I quit the team after that meet. Coach Mitchell told everyone I'd quit because I couldn't handle the pressure of competition. He never acknowledged that he'd nearly put me in the hospital with his outdated and dangerous coaching philosophy. The school kept him on as coach for several more years until he finally retired. During that time, 2 more runners had heat-related emergencies at meets. It apparently takes multiple students collapsing before anyone questions whether a coach's methods might be the problem. That's the end of that story. Coach Mitchell cared more about winning championships than about the health and well-being of the students he was supposed to be developing. His outdated ideas about pushing through pain and limiting hydration were dangerous, but the school protected him because he won meets. Some coaches really do treat teenage athletes like professional competitors who should sacrifice everything for sport. Let's move to this next story about how one lie can snowball into something massive. During my senior year, I was dating this girl named Emma, who was in my English class. We'd been together for about 4 months, and things were going pretty well. We'd hang out after school, go to movies on weekends, normal high school relationship stuff. One Friday night, Emma asked if I wanted to come over to her house to watch movies because her parents were going to be out for the evening. I said yes, and we made plans for me to come over around 7 o'clock. That afternoon, my mom reminded me that we had family dinner plans with my aunt and uncle who were visiting from out of state. I'd completely forgotten about it. I felt bad about cancelling on Emma, but I couldn't skip family dinner. Here's where I made a stupid decision. Instead of just telling Emma the truth that I had a family obligation, I panicked and told her I was feeling sick. I said I had a bad stomachache and needed to stay home. It was a dumb lie, but it seemed easier than explaining the family dinner thing and potentially dealing with her being disappointed. Emma was understanding and told me to feel better. I went to dinner with my family and thought that was the end of it. But what I didn't know was that Emma had decided to be sweet and bring me soup and medicine since I was supposedly sick. She showed up at my house around 8:30 while I was still at dinner with my family. My younger sister answered the door and told Emma that I wasn't home because I was at a restaurant with the family. Emma was confused because I'd told her I was sick at home. When I got back from dinner around 9:30, I had multiple texts from Emma asking me to explain why I'd lied about being sick. I immediately knew I'd screwed up. I called her and tried to explain that I'd just forgotten about the family dinner and panicked when I realised I had to cancel our plans. Emma was really hurt and said that if I'd just been honest, she would have understood. But the fact that I'd lied to her made her feel like she couldn't trust me. I apologised repeatedly and said it was a stupid mistake that wouldn't happen again. But Emma told some of her friends about what happened, and the story got twisted as it spread. By Monday morning at school, the rumour going around was that I'd lied about being sick so I could go on a date with another girl. People were saying I'd been cheating on Emma and using the sick excuse to cover it up. I tried to correct the story and explain what had actually happened, but nobody wanted to hear the boring truth when the cheating rumour was so much more dramatic. Emma's friends were calling me a cheater and a liar in the hallways. People I barely knew were giving me dirty looks. Emma broke up with me, which I understood because I had lied to her. But she also seemed to believe the rumours that I'd been cheating, even though I explained multiple times that I'd just gone to dinner with my family. She said that if I could lie about being sick, she couldn't trust anything else I said. The rumour kept growing and getting more elaborate. Some versions had me dating 2 or 3 girls at the same time. Others had me getting caught on a date by Emma herself. None of it was true, but people believed the exciting lies over the mundane reality. My reputation was destroyed over what had started as a small, stupid lie to avoid an awkward conversation. I went from being a regular student with a normal social life to being known as the guy who cheated on his girlfriend. Girls wouldn't talk to me because they'd heard I was untrustworthy. Guys would make jokes about my supposed player lifestyle. I tried showing people my credit card statement from that Friday night proving I'd been at the restaurant my family went to. I tried getting my sister to confirm the story. But once a rumour takes hold, facts don't really matter anymore. People believe what they want to believe. The whole situation taught me that small lies can have huge consequences when other people fill in the gaps with their own assumptions. It also taught me that trying to avoid minor discomfort by lying usually creates much bigger problems down the line. By the time I graduated a few months later, some people still believed I was a serial cheater. The whole mess started because I didn't want to have a slightly uncomfortable conversation about cancelling plans for family dinner. That's the end of that story. A small lie told to avoid minor awkwardness spiraled into a reputation-destroying rumour that no amount of truth could fully undo. Once the story became more interesting than the reality, people chose to believe the exciting version regardless of evidence. Some lessons about honesty really do come from learning the hard way. This next story shows how one teacher's personal problems can affect their students. I took Spanish 3 during my junior year with Senora Williams, who'd been teaching at our school for probably 20 years. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, and most students who'd had her said she was a good teacher even if her class was challenging. The school year started normally enough. Senora Williams went over the syllabus, established her expectations, and started teaching. Her lessons were well organized, and she seemed passionate about helping us actually learn to speak Spanish rather than just memorizing vocabulary for tests. But about 6 weeks into the semester, something changed. Senora Williams started showing up to class looking tired and distracted. Her lessons became less organized, and sometimes she'd lose track of what she was teaching mid-sentence. She started giving us a lot of independent work time while she sat at her desk staring at her computer. We later found out through the school gossip network that she was going through a difficult divorce. Her husband had apparently left her for someone else, and she was dealing with custody issues regarding their kids. Obviously, that's an incredibly stressful situation, and everyone felt bad for what she was going through. But the personal problems started seriously affecting her teaching. She'd forget to grade assignments for weeks at a time. She stopped planning lessons and would just tell us to work on exercises from the textbook with no instruction or guidance. Some days she'd show up 10 minutes late to class looking like she'd been crying. The worst part was that her emotional state made her really unpredictable in how she treated students. Some days, she'd be overly nice and let us do whatever we wanted. Other days, she'd snap at students for minor things like asking to use the bathroom or not understanding an instruction. One day, a student named Marcus asked a question about verb conjugation, and Senora Williams completely lost it. She started yelling at him that if he'd been paying attention, he'd know the answer, and that she was tired of students expecting her to repeat everything. Marcus hadn't been doing anything wrong. She was just taking out her stress on him. Another time, she gave us a test on material she'd never actually taught. When students pointed this out, she said we should have been reading ahead in the textbook and that she shouldn't have to spoon-feed us every concept. About half the class failed that test. Students started complaining to their parents and to the administration about how the class was falling apart. We weren't learning much of anything. Grades were unpredictable, and the emotional atmosphere in the classroom was uncomfortable because nobody knew which version of Senora Williams would show up each day. The administration's response was basically to tell us to be patient and understanding because she was going through a difficult time. The vice principal said that Senora Williams was a valued member of the faculty who deserved support during her personal crisis. Which was true, but it didn't change the fact that we were paying the price for that crisis in the form of a terrible education. Some parents pushed harder and demanded that something be done. Eventually, the school brought in a long-term substitute to co-teach the class with Senora Williams. The substitute would handle the actual instruction, while Senora Williams was technically still the teacher of record. But even with the substitute there, the class remained chaotic. Senora Williams would sometimes contradict what the substitute had taught, or she'd grade assignments using completely different criteria than what had been explained. Students never knew which teacher's instructions to follow. By the end of the semester, most of us felt like we'd wasted a year of language education. The students who'd taken Spanish 3 with different teachers had learned significantly more and had much better preparation for Spanish 4. We'd spent a semester dealing with a teacher's personal breakdown instead of actually learning. I have sympathy for what Senora Williams was going through. Divorce and custody battles are devastating. But at some point, if your personal problems are preventing you from doing your job, you need to take leave rather than inflicting that dysfunction on students who are depending on you for their education. The school should have stepped in sooner and more decisively. They protected a teacher who wasn't capable of teaching at the expense of students who deserved better. By the time they brought in a substitute, we'd already missed half the semester of actual instruction. That's the end of that story. Senora Williams's personal crisis was real and deserving of compassion, but allowing her to continue teaching while unable to function professionally hurt an entire class of students. The administration chose to protect a teacher rather than ensure students were getting the education they were supposed to receive. Some situations require tough decisions, and letting someone keep teaching while they're falling apart isn't kindness to anyone. Moving to this next story, about how schools handle mental health crises. I had a really close friend named Alex during sophomore and junior year. We'd met in band class, and bonded over shared interests in music and video games. He was funny, creative, and someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. We'd hang out almost every day after school and text constantly. Around the middle of junior year, I started noticing that Alex seemed different. He was quieter than usual, seemed tired all the time, and stopped wanting to hang out as much. When we did hang out, he seemed distracted and sad. I asked him if everything was okay, and he said he was just stressed about school and family stuff. Over the next few weeks, Alex became more withdrawn. He'd skip band rehearsals, which was unusual because he loved playing music. He stopped responding to texts as quickly, and when he did respond, his messages were short and flat. I was worried, but didn't really know what to do. One day, during lunch, Alex said something that really scared me. He said he didn't see the point of anything anymore, and that he wished he could just stop existing. He said it in this casual tone, like he was commenting on the weather, but the words themselves were alarming. I didn't know how to respond. I asked if he was okay, and he said he was fine, just tired. I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too scary to think about. But something in my gut told me this was serious. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Alex had said. I looked up warning signs of depression and suicidal thoughts, and a lot of what I read matched what I'd been seeing in his behavior. I decided I needed to tell an adult, even though I was afraid Alex would be angry at me for breaking his confidence. The next morning, I went to our school counselor, Mr. Patterson, and told him that I was worried about Alex. I repeated what he'd said about not seeing the point of anything and wishing he could stop existing. Mr. Patterson asked some questions about Alex's recent behavior, and I described the changes I'd noticed. Mr. Patterson said he'd talked to Alex and thanked me for coming forward. He said I'd done the right thing by reporting my concerns. I felt guilty and worried that I'd betrayed Alex's trust, but I told myself it was better to have him angry at me than to have something terrible happen. Later that day, Alex got called out of class to meet with Mr. Patterson. After the meeting, the school called Alex's parents and told them about the concerning statements he'd made. His parents took him to see a doctor that same day. Alex ended up being diagnosed with clinical depression and started therapy and medication. His parents were shocked because they hadn't realized how much he'd been struggling. They were grateful that someone had spoken up. But Alex was furious with me. He said I'd had no right to tell the counselor about our private conversation. He said I'd embarrassed him and made everyone think he was crazy. He accused me of betraying his trust and making his life worse. I tried to explain that I'd been scared for his safety and didn't know what else to do. Alex said that if he'd really wanted help, he would have asked for it himself. He stopped talking to me completely and wouldn't acknowledge me in the hallways or band class. For weeks, I felt terrible. I questioned whether I'd done the right thing. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I'd destroyed our friendship over nothing. Other friends told me I should have minded my own business and let Alex handle his own problems. But a few months later, Alex's mum called my mum to thank me. She said that getting Alex into treatment had probably saved his life. He'd been having serious suicidal thoughts that he'd been hiding from everyone. The intervention had gotten him the help he desperately needed. Alex and I never became close friends again. He eventually stopped being angry at me, and we'd have polite conversations sometimes, but the friendship never recovered. I think I reminded him of a really dark time in his life that he wanted to move past. Looking back, I'm confident I made the right choice, even though it cost me the friendship. Alex is alive and doing much better now, which wouldn't necessarily be true if I'd stayed silent. But I also understand why he was angry and why our friendship couldn't survive what happened. The whole experience taught me that sometimes doing the right thing means losing something important. It also taught me that when someone shows signs of being in crisis, saying something might make them angry, but staying silent could have much worse consequences. That's the end of that story. Reporting concerns about Alex's mental health cost me a friendship, but potentially saved his life. The school counselor handled it appropriately by taking the concern seriously and involving Alex's parents immediately. Sometimes, the right choice isn't the comfortable choice, and protecting someone's safety has to come before protecting their feelings or preserving a friendship. Let's finish with this story about how colleges can completely mislead students. During my junior year, I started the college application process. I was really interested in this one university that had a strong program in my intended major and seemed like a perfect fit. I visited the campus during the summer before senior year and fell in love with everything about it. The campus was beautiful, the students seemed happy, and the admissions presentation made it sound like an amazing place to spend 4 years. The admissions officer who gave the presentation talked a lot about how the university valued diversity and was committed to supporting first-generation college students like me. Neither of my parents had gone to college, so this was really important to me. She described all these support programs and resources specifically designed to help first-gen students succeed. I applied early decision because I was so sure this was where I wanted to go. When I got accepted in December, I was thrilled. I committed immediately and spent the rest of senior year excitedly planning for college. Orientation week arrived in August, and that's when I started noticing that the reality didn't match what had been advertised. The special support programs for first-gen students that had been prominently featured in the admissions materials were basically non-existent. There was one advisor who was supposed to serve about 300 first-gen students, so getting actual support was nearly impossible. The diversity that had been showcased during my campus visit turned out to be exaggerated. The university had clearly scheduled my visit during a week when they knew diverse student groups would be highly visible. The actual student body was much less diverse than the admissions materials had suggested, but the biggest disappointment was the academic program I'd enrolled in. The admissions, materials, and website had described incredible opportunities for undergraduate research, small class sizes, and personalized attention from professors. The reality was completely different. My first semester, all my major courses were huge lectures with 200 plus students. The professors were distant and inaccessible, holding office hours at times that conflicted with my other classes. The undergraduate research opportunities I'd been excited about were mostly reserved for juniors and seniors, and even then, spots were extremely competitive. I tried talking to my assigned academic advisor about my concerns, and she basically told me that first-year students needed to adjust their expectations. She said the personalized attention and research opportunities would come later, and that large lecture classes were normal for introductory courses. But that's not what the admissions office had told me. The financial aid package I'd received also turned out to be misleading. The university had given me what seemed like a generous scholarship for my first year, but buried in the fine print was information that the scholarship wasn't renewable. My second year, my costs would increase significantly. This hadn't been made clear during the admissions process. I felt completely deceived. I'd made a binding early decision commitment based on information that turned out to be exaggerated or false. If I'd known the reality, I would have applied to different schools and had more options. But now I was locked into this university for at least my first year. I talked to other first-gen students and found that many of them felt similarly misled. The university had sold us on a vision of support and opportunity that didn't materialize once we'd committed and paid our deposits. We'd been targeted with marketing that highlighted programs and resources that were more theoretical than real. By second semester, I was seriously considering transferring, but transferring meant starting the application process over, potentially losing credits, and dealing with new uncertainty. I also worried about the stigma of being someone who couldn't hack it at their first choice school. I ended up staying at the university and graduating 4 years later, but I never stopped feeling resentful about how misleading the admissions process had been. The education I received was fine, but it wasn't what I'd been promised, and the financial burden was much greater than I'd anticipated based on the initial aid package. The whole experience taught me that colleges are businesses that market themselves like any other product. They highlight their strengths, minimize their weaknesses, and sometimes make promises they can't keep. The glossy brochures and polished admissions presentations are advertising, not honest representations of what students will actually experience. I wish I'd been more skeptical and done more research beyond what the admissions office provided. I wish I'd talked to current students who weren't being paid to give tours. I wish I'd read between the lines of vague promises about support and resources. That's the end of that story. The university's admissions process was essentially false advertising targeted at students who didn't know enough to question the marketing. They highlighted programs that barely existed and made promises they had no intention of keeping. By the time students realize they've been misled, they've already committed and paid deposits. Some institutions really do prioritize enrollment numbers over honest representation of what they actually offer. These stories show just how messed up school systems can be when adults abuse their power, students betray each other, and policies prioritize everything except actual fairness and education. From teachers playing favorites to administrators covering up their own incompetence, the common thread is that students get hurt while the people responsible face minimal consequences. If you enjoyed this collection of Reddit stories, consider subscribing for more. Thanks for sticking around until the end, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next one. Take care.